All right. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I have the privilege, I guess, of seeing everybody's name, and man, it's good to at least read all of your names, the folks who are joining us today. It's been a long time since I've seen many of you, and hopefully this time next year, we'll be able to see each other face to face. So my name is Katie Ringsmith, and today America is recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm coming to you from Eagle River, Alaska, where I'm looking out at the arm of Takotnu, the Kanik, and over the traditional lands of the Deina. I want to thank Karen, the entire Alaska Historical Society board, and the presenters, especially those who have already given compelling and thought-provoking papers so far. This is an enormous effort, and I just want to thank everybody for pulling it off. I also want to share that tomorrow is my 52nd birthday. Now, the Alaska Historical Society annual meetings often falls right around my birthday, and it always reminds me of Bev Beaton. And she and I at the annual conferences had this running joke about aging, and I'd share it with you all, but there are a few F-bombs, so perhaps now that we're recording this session, I may not share that with you, but hopefully I will when we meet again. But it does make today's meeting a bit bittersweet nonetheless. It's also the end of summer, and baseball's postseason is in full swing, and it's also the first meeting without our dear friend Terrence. And I know many of you miss him terribly. Think about his humor, especially how it infused historical discourse over the years, and how he would respond thoughtfully with constant curiosity to our many wonderful presentations today and throughout this conference. Terrence was brave, and he stood up for the integrity of history. And I am so proud of the Alaska Historical Society for standing up for history too. So now I'd like to turn to Bristol Bay, a very special region in which three very special presenters for whom I have such great admiration are here today to share a part of Bristol Bay history with you. Our first presenter is Tim Troll. Tim is an attorney, he's an artist, historian, but mostly Tim is a defender and protector of Bristol Bay salmon. Tim is the executive director of the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust. And since its inception in 2000, Tim has helped secure conservation easements on nearly 37,000 acres of salmon habitat and water level restoration for fish in 5 major river systems. Tim once wrote that, quote, "The work I do is largely influenced by my unexplainable fascination with the history and cultures of Southwest Alaska." Tim's most recent book is Bristol Bay Remembers the Great Flu of 1919, and he is currently working on a second edition of the book Sailing for Salmon. So now I'd like to hand it over to Tim Troll. Thanks.
Katie, I only gave you 2 sentences.
I know, I embellished a little.
All right.
You're more than 2 sentences.
Well, it's great to be here, and great to be here with 2 of the other guys that can sit around and drink beer or coffee and bore each other about the history of Bristol Bay. So I guess I get to start, and I'm going to try this whole thing with sharing screen. All right.
You need to make it an actual slideshow.
Yep, got it.
Yep, got it. Okay, good.
Just trying to get the little button there.
Right, now you got to go back to your, there we go.
All right, well, in 1996, I was fortunate to move to Dillingham in Alaska's Bristol Bay. And while there, I developed an interest in the history of the region. And upon reading James Van Stone's Eskimos of the Nushagak and talking to local residents like Yalmer Olson, the more I came to realize that a small summer fishing camp named Nushagak across the river from Dillingham was the key for understanding how many historical events unfolded in the region after the Russian explorers and traders first ventured into it back in 1818. In this presentation, I look at some of the early images and photographs of Nushagak to visualize what the village and the trading post looked like in 1867 when it was transferred to the Americans, and what became of the village and how local residents and others continue to celebrate and remember it. Nushagak, first called Alexandrovsky Redoubt by the Russian-American company, was built at a place the local Yupik called Kvichak, like an elbow, around 1819 under the direction of Fyodor Kalmykov, a native of Tobolsk. Kalmykov managed the trading station for 20 years and was the driving force that expanded Russian trade into Western Alaska. He was also a very religious man, and the Russian Orthodox faith that is still actively practiced in Western Alaska began at Nushagak. When Kalmykov died in 1839, he was buried on the hill above the village, and a 20-foot pole topped by a globe and Orthodox cross was erected above his grave in his honor, and we'll follow that through these photos. He was succeeded by John W. Clark in the American era, who expanded the influence of Nushagak and is credited with being one of the founders of the lucrative Bristol Bay commercial fishery. Clark died in 1886, and he too is buried there. So what we're looking at here is the first sketch that we really have, visual sketch of Bristol Bay by Henry Elliott when he traveled through the region in the 1870s. And I've just marked out here some of the things, the trading post, the trader's house, the church and the priest's house, and the graveyard. The trading post and store, we think, was actually built by the Americans. Here's how that same village appeared in his publication several years later. And particularly note that the pole and the hill behind with the Kalmykov pole is more pronounced in this particular image. He discussed it quite a bit in his book as being a prominent landmark. Here's an early sketch showing some of the same village, the same composition of buildings by Ivan Petroff, who came through there in the 1880s in the census. And again, we're trying to identify the store, what probably was the trader's home, and the Russian church, and most of the descriptions of a native village, basically on the back, Barabras. Nushagak basically has 3 tierces, and that's kind of what we're seeing up on the second tierce. So here's a couple of early first images. We see the Russian church, the Russian priest's house, those buildings also identified in here. We see, of course, kayaks and drying racks right on the beach. Probably another photograph maybe from the Swinford expedition. We see the Russian era church. This church was built around 1860. So it was a survivor of the Russian period. Same with the priest's house, which we know was built in 1857. Now we're on the top of one of the tierces, looking now behind over across Nushagak Bay with the Russian house. Here's an image from 1884, the Hartman and Wineland Moravian expedition. And point out again, we see the Kalmykov pole up in the background. I also want to point out, maybe this is the beginning of people putting moose racks and caribou racks on their houses. You can see a moose rack on top of what we believe is probably the Russian, the trader's house, which is survivor from the Russian period. And you can see the little caribou horns. This is also actually pretty important from the standpoint of fish and wildlife, because moose are fairly current residents in the region. And we do see that they were at least one was there around 1884. Here again are some more images from the Wineland period. Probably one of the more classic images taken by Guy Cameron, photographer in the region, more classic images of Nushagak, and we see 2 different styles of kayaks on that rack behind us there. Again, more images, the building on the left probably being from the American period, the Bishop building on the right. You can see the gardens in front and the stairway. Here's the Russian-era church in around 1890. The interior of that church as it was photographed in 1884. Here, back up on the hill again, looking at the priest's house at that time and the church. And the native dwellings, and a pretty good image of what looks to be the Kolmikov pole still surviving some 60 years after it was put up. Still see what appears to be the Kolmikov monument, and this is probably what I would guess is the probable extent of development of Nushagak at the end of the Russian period, where we see the original Russian priest's house, the original church, and at least the original one of the trading stores over on the right. It's very likely that on this lower shelf is where the actual Russian fort was originally built by Kolmikov, but we can only really guess at that. So here's actually a postcard I found in a postcard collection, looking across, again, now we're way up on top of the hill, looking across Nushagak Bay at what we call out there Warehouse Mountain, and looking it through, it's a huge graveyard up there, most of it now under alders, but it looks in this period that we can still see the Kolmikov pole, I think, circled off there to the left. So here's a classic image taken by John Thwaites, taken around 1904. Now we're into the American period, and we're seeing the greatest period of expansion. We now have two canneries. The Pacific Steam and Whaling Company cannery was built in 99, 3 years after John W. Clark's death. We now see the old Russian church is gone, and centered in the village is the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, built in 1904. And then we also have the Alaska Fishermen's Packing Company cannery, built in 1903. And this is Thwaites probably sitting in a ship looking directly at the village, around 1908, 1906. Looking around on eBay once, I found this collection of photographs that when I looked through them, I could see the few of them that were shown were Nushagak. So I bid on it, paid too much money for it, but finally did get it, and it's now in the collection of the Anchorage Museum. But here we do see, same time Thwaites was taking photographs, some very clear images of a newer Russian priest's house, the new church, these are taken about 1910, by C.W. Ray. He was a teacher at Nushagak, at least for that year. We also see the appearance of a new building, probably built by possibly John W. Clark, but maybe his successor, Mittendorf. But here we get a nice winter view of Nushagak. Here's a great one, Mittendorf store in the middle. We now get to see that new building off on the left, which does play an important role in something a little bit later. This is a fun, when I picture these together, this is a series where Ray obviously went out in front of the village and then does a sweeping shot from left to right, looking upriver, downriver at the community. And I'm just gonna sweep through this. Here we see the Whalers Cannery. Now he's shifting his camera a little bit closer. Now we're looking straight at the village. You can see the church off to the right. And then swinging now, going downriver. The interesting thing is you can see these little footprints coming out in the mud where he's obviously where he's set up to take the photo, this mud may be an indication of one of the reasons why Nushagak Canneries finally left. And then now we're swinging downhill. Now we're looking at the Alaska Fishermen's Packing Company cannery. So now we're looking directly at that downriver. You can see some of the sailboats there. And then doing that same sweep with some photographs by John Thwaites from now on the top of the hill. Now we're looking at the Whalers Cannery, looking upriver, swinging around to the front. Now looking across the river where we would see the mountains if it was clear enough day. You can still see the gardens in front of the village. Swinging over, now we're at the top of the Russian church, the new Russian church, St. Peter and St. Paul, and swinging on over to the Fisherman's Cannery. And here's a couple of shots, one by Thwaites and one by C.W. Ray of the Russian church, the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. Here's the interior of that church. And then this is a photograph taken by James Van Stone when he was actually there in 1969, excavating the village. It still survived up until 1969. And then Bob maybe remember this, then it burnt down in 1982 when somebody who was, I guess, a grass fire got out of control and burned the church down in 1982. So that's the village that's gone, but it's not forgotten. First thing I want to talk about is the hands. You might remember that one building I was telling you about. This is a famous photograph on the left by John Thwaites. And it sort of came back into the sort of imagination of the people out there as a result of the Yupik mask exhibit that Ann Reard in the Ancient Museum put together back in the 90s. And those hands were a part of that exhibit. They didn't go anywhere except there. But we did manage to find out where they were. They were with the Smithsonian Museum, and they are now on a long-term loan back to the museum in Dillingham. So that's one way that the people of the region wanted to sort of recapture some of that history from the Nushagak. Then here's a photograph of Nushagak circa 1908, again by Thwaites. Here's an image that same direction, and now in the place of the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, you see this giant Russian cross. And in 1999, I think it was about then, the residents of the Dillingham decided, as was traditional in the Russian Orthodox religion, that wherever a church once was, a cross should be placed on it in that same location. So here's a few shots of people. This was a huge cross made by Gusty Wall out of Dillingham, who said, he was approached by the church to build one, and he said he wanted to make it big enough to see from his house in Dillingham. So he did that. It's a bit of a challenge to get it over there and get it up, but they did. Fell down one time, and these are photographs of it going back up the next year. There's Gusty right in the middle there, looking at it, finally getting it up. And that's the size of it compared to those who put it up. There it is looming over the village. It was about 40 feet tall. Gusty made it of fiberglass and plywood. But it fell down finally in 2016. And that's the way it looks today. So although there have been books, here are two. One, Our Fur Fathers of Southwest Alaska by Bev Sims, who a couple of years ago began tracing all the family heritage that came out of particularly Kolmakov and the other early Russians, and how their names have dispersed through families throughout all of Bristol Bay, as well as the YK Delta. And actually, in many ways, how his line intersected with John W. Clark's line. So she privately printed that book. And then, of course, the eminent historian, John Branson, wrote a biography of John W. Clark back in 2012. And I accompanied John when he was trying to interview John W. Clark back in the day, but John was rather uncooperative, Mr. Clark was. There's John and I at his grave back in, I think about that same year. And then now the pole. Here's the image of that pole in 1900. And then here's an image of how that pole was restored in 2017 and put back. You may remember this character, Dr. Mikhail Malakov, who was with us at our 2017 conference, and on one of his expeditions, we decided to see if we can restore that pole. And here we are. It was done. Back up. And so the last thing is a little film that the film crew that was with Malakov did. And if I can get it going here, that will conclude my presentation.
История Русской Америки писалась совместно россиянами и жителями Аляски. Поэтому логично, что память о тех или иных исторических событиях они должны хранить вместе. Вот этот памятный знак был установлен группой энтузиастов из России и Аляски в честь первопроходцев Бристольского залива, россиянина Федора Лаврентьевича Колпакова и Джона Ларка. Потомки помнят.
So that's it. And that poll is still there as of 2021. So hopefully it might last another 60 years. So that's my presentation, Katie.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tim, for that sweeping story of change over time and the meaning of place to the people of Bristol Bay. So I notice that a few of you guys are adding questions to the chat. We will hold all the questions till after all the speakers give their presentations. So with that, I am going to introduce our second presenter, John Branson, the historian at Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. John has lived in the Bristol Bay region for 52 years, and he lives in Port Allsworth on Lake Clark, where he's given his presentation from as we speak. John graduated from the Boston University School of Education in 1969, and from that point on, he moved to Alaska, where he taught social studies at the Bristol Bay High School in Naknek for 1 year. And John never looked back, except, of course, to root for his beloved Boston Red Sox. So John has written several books about the Bristol Bay area, including, as Tim pointed out, The Life and Times of John W. Clark, The Canneries, Cabins, and Caches of Bristol Bay, a huge fan favorite. And his latest book is The Dawn of Aviation Around Lake Clark Pass. So without further me talking, John, go for it. Oh, John, you want to unmute. So hit the little mute button on the bottom of your screen there on the left.
Thank you, Katie, for your kind introduction. And I'm pleased to represent Lake Clark National Park and Preserve today to talk about Petroff's Malchatna villages that he documented in the report of the population, industries, and resources of Alaska published in 1884, and it was part of the 10th census. And here's the map from his book, and the Malchatna villages are listed there, shown there. It's not that accurate, but it's at least he documented their existence. And from that, I got interested in the Malchatna villages because many of the people of non-Dalton trace their ancestry to the Malchatna villages. And the non-Dalton people have a really high regard for the Malchatna country, and many of the older folks have trapped there in the past, but many of the elders that I was working with, and Jim Carey, the noted linguist from the University of Alaska Native Language Center, working with elders in the mid-'80s, documented the names of 5 different Malchatna villages, but no one alive knew exactly where they were. So we just knew they were by confluences of tributary streams in the Malchatna River. So the idea to go out and locate these villages with a systematic archaeological survey came about in the late 90s. And it went on, we started in 2000, and it went on every year through 2007. And I wanted to mention the agencies. It was a multi-agency effort. Here's another view of a more contemporary map, but it has native place names. And you can see with the Malchatna villages in XLC-108, that was one site we found. And we had our primary excavation out of all those 7 or 8 years. We picked out one of the Malchatna villages. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention the agencies. This is on the Malchatna in this area. Well, it starts, let's just put it this way. The Malchatna River is 175 miles long. It's a wild and scenic river. The upper portion is, and it starts in Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, in Turquoise Lake and Twin Lakes. And they drain the main Malchatna coming out of Turquoise, and then the Chillicothe coming out of lower Twin Lakes. They merge downstream and become a big Malchatna. But at any rate, we wanted to list the agencies, and it's state land where we surveyed for the most part, and it was selected by the Lake and Peninsula Borough. And so the state of Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Division of History and Archaeology, they had archaeologists participate, and the Non-Dalton Tribal Council had members come out and join us, and Lake Clark National Park and Preserve had archaeologists, and the BIA Angsta office had one archaeologist, Matt O'Leary, who wrote a really detailed book on our 7 or 8 year survey. The Canneries tribe and the Kenai Peninsula College, Alan Boris also participated out there on archaeological survey. And Northern Wilderness Adventures is a big game hunting lodge owned by a fellow named Nick Perscala. And he was such a great help to us because the Malchatna is very difficult to get around, and we had to have good people that knew how to run jet boats on the river because it's quite shallow and it's quite swift. And then McKinley Capital Management and Bob Gillum, the late Bob Gillum, were very interested and very supportive financially to us, because we had went on a shoestring budget. The main purpose was to illuminate the occupation of the Dina Ina along the upper Malchatna River Valley. And it was the first systematic archaeological survey of the Malchatna. So we could go down a couple slides now, if we could, to the next slide would be fine, if you could get that right there in those. If you could just go back one to where the map with the boxes showing where we surveyed, right there within those rectangles, those were where we surveyed. And it's very difficult country to operate in, and so it wasn't completely, we didn't get every square inch, of course, because there's so many side channels, tributaries, sloughs, and so forth. But we did, a pretty comprehensive look nonetheless. At some years, we spent at least 3 weeks out there working twice. Like we would go in the spring for a couple of weeks and then in the fall for a couple of weeks. So next slide, please. There is an aerial view of a typical view of the upper Malchatna River, where you've got the main stem in the foreground, and then you have sloughs and tributaries in the background. And it's interspersed with spruce and birch timber. And we found the villages in alluvial soils, and birch and white spruce, and they were they're not on the main stem because of potential flooding, so they were located on sloughs, off sloughs, so they weren't right obvious to anyone. You had to know where you were going, and they were safe from the spring floods and the fall floods. Next, please. There's a view of the Mosquito River, and that's about midpoint on the river, and that is where the Dina Ina territory, the place names stop there. And we did find a village there, but when we say that we find villages, we don't necessarily mean that we found every village in that section, because again, it's very difficult to survey, and it was just, we did the best we could, and we found 16 different locations of Dina Ina villages, and the villages are small. Next, please. This is the lunchbox site that we excavated, and it's 19th century houses, and they're what they were built down a couple of feet into the ground, and then they're log houses closely fitted together, and they had gable roofs and sod and bark roofs and dirt piled up against the sides. And that's why the berm, you can see the berms that's what they look like today. They are, thick, vegetated walls that had collapsed over time. Next, please. This is a view of the North Kvichak site, and I just put this in here to compare and contrast the Malchatna villages. There may be three at one time, three houses together. And so the resources weren't as rich as they were at Kvichak National Historic Landmark, which is the largest Athabascan archaeological site in the state of Alaska. And so you can see there's many more houses at Kvichak. That was a bigger population. Perhaps I'd like to call it the Manhattan of the Dinaina inland Dinaina world, where the Malchatna, they were spread out and smaller hamlets, as it were. Next, please. This is the largest house at the lunchbox site. And the main room, the green rectangular features, that's where we excavated. In the main room, they had central hearth, and the back room was typically a steam bath, and there were fire-cracked rocks. Fire-cracked rocks in the corners where they would heat them up and bring them in and have steam bath. And then the other room there on the front left might be a sleeping chamber, but there were multiple families in the tunnel entrance. So overall, it's about 30 feet from the right-hand wall to the left-hand wall. Next, please. Here's some shapes of the houses there, scattered around the different sites that we found. Again, instead of like at Kvichak, where you could have 19, 20 houses in a group, this is 2 or 3 at the most on the Malchatna. In the Malchatna country is about 35 miles from the Kvichak area, and they were contemporaneous, and they had contact with each other, and they had shared the same type of trade goods. And there were some Hudson Bay trade muskets that were brought in there probably in the 1840s. So that must have been a great help to them for their hunting. Next, please. There's another view. The houses are called Nietzsche, and you can see the one on the left with the tunnel entrance, and they're generally facing to the south or west, the openings. And then the steam bathrooms, and then there's a complicated one in the lower right corner there that had multiple rooms, a steam bath, and then could be individual sleeping quarters for families. Next, please. Here's another view of another site at the Kvichak National Historic Landmark to show you the difference, where you might have 2 houses on the Malchatna and then go 5 miles and have another 2 houses. Here you have, dense population in the multiple room house on the bottom part of that left center. That's 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with 4 different rooms. So next, please. I wanted to show pictures of people who were born in the Malchatna. And so that's what the rest of these slides are going to be. And these people were all born in the late 19th century, and it was what drove them out was the commercial fishery on the lower Nushagak River, where they corked off the river and they didn't allow salmon to come up through because they had salmon traps. And the priest at Nushagak encouraged the Dineenah people to move to Lake Clark and Iliamna because they were starving. And also around the decade of the 1880s, and perhaps even into the earlier in the 70s, the first prospectors came by upriver. So the Dineenah were affected by smallpox, scarlet fever, flu, measles, TB, those types of things attrited down the population, where Petroff estimated 180 people living in the various Malchatna villages. Russian Orthodox records suggest that there could have been 230 or so in the 1880s living in the villages, but by the 1890s, most of the people had left there because of the difficulty in getting salmon, the epidemic diseases, and the opening of a trading post closer to them at Iliamna if they moved to Kvichak. So here is this lady, Agafia Sava Anderson, with her children at Naknek in 1918. Agafia was related to Mary Ann Trefon, who lived on Lake Clark, and both of them were born in the Malchatna villages. I don't know which village, but there is Agafia, and she died in the late, 1925 of TB. Next, please. This is Daria Sava, who was born in one of the Malchatna villages, and the wife of Pete Sava, a reindeer herder at Eagle Bay on the north shore of Iliamna Lake. This photo was taken by Als Herlichka of the Smithsonian Institute, and the photo is courtesy of the National Anthropological Archive, Smithsonian Institution. This is near the Severson's Roadhouse on Iliamna Lake. Next, please. This is Mary Ann Trefon at Tenalian Point, where she lived many years. She was born in one of the Malchatna villages and was orphaned at a young age, probably by epidemic diseases taking her parents. And she was a real competent subsistence person. She could row boats across Lake Clark and trap, hunt, do everything. So she was sewing and doctored her children. So she was quite a competent lady. And her husband was named Trefon Beluda from Talakwana band of the Dineenah. Next, please. This is Pete Sava at the Eagle Bay, or at Severson's Roadhouse, photographed by Herdlichka. At the same time, he photographed Pete's wife, and he too came from the Malchatna. Next, please. Ivan Nudelash is second from the left, and his sister, Yenlu Nudelash Severson, is on the right, sitting down, holding a child, and they were both from the Malchatna villages, brother and sister, and came over in the early 20th century from the Malchatna villages and lived their lives out there at Lake Clark. Next, please. The man on the left is Fija, or Pete Del Kitty, and his wife, Olga Nudelash, and her sister, Mary Nudelash Beluda on the right. And they're at their house around 1935 in Old Nundalton. And all three of them came from the Malchatna River villages. And Pete is one of two people that I've been able to find where he was born. He was born at a village that was near the Springway Creek confluence with the Malchatna, and we did find one or two houses around the Springway Creek, so he could have come from those villages, but he was known as a good packer and guide for prospectors. Next, please. This is another photo of Pete. His middle name was, or his nickname was Kvichak, Del Kitty. And there he is down at Severson's Roadhouse in 1921. And with him on the right is a fellow named Ivan Koktalash. And they were packing sheep trophy and snowshoes for a couple of men from New York City who were in for a sport hunt up on Lake Clark. Next, please. This is a fellow, Starity Van Yvonne, photographed in the 1930s near 6 Mile Lake and was born in one of the Malchatna villages in the late 19th century. He has his rifle with him. I'm sure he used that a lot when he was living on the Malchatna. Next, please. Old Nikolai is seen on the left and Wonka Zakar on the right, near Old Ilyamna village around 1920. And Wonka Zakar was born at the Malchatna village that was right near the confluence with the Chilchitna River. He was known as a superb bear hunter and woodworker, and he never used a ruler or measuring tape. He just used his fingers, his hand, and up to his elbow and then up to his shoulder for measuring. But he was known to make really great snug log cabins, and there they are with a brown bear. They were obviously excellent big game hunters. Next, please. This is Gilly Koktalash, who was born on one of the villages on the Malchatna. He was the father of the late honored elder from Nundalton, Pete Koktalash. And Gilly was photographed at his home in Old Nundalton around 1936. And this photo is courtesy of Helena Severson Moses, a granddaughter of Hans and Yenlu Severson, who has the Severson photo collection. Next, please. This is Dick Micey on the left with a box, walking down to the shoreline there at Kvichak on the north shore of Ilyamna Lake, and his wife is in the right, named Wasilisa Yvonne Micey. They were both born at the Malchatna villages. They were photographed in Kvichak in 1921 by sport hunter Frederick K. Vreeland in New York City. And the woman in the center is Alana Beluda Kenny. She was originally from the Stony River Band and the wife of a fellow, an old Klondiker who moved down to the Lake Ilyamna country, early 20th century, named Jack Kenny. Next, please. This is a bunch of Dinina guides and packers with prospectors in the Malchatna country circa 1908 or 9. And Marka Karshakov, he's the third from the right on the back row. He was one of the guides and packers, and he was born in one of the Malchatna villages in the 1880s. There's 4 Dinina guides there, and then Oliver B. Millett and his wife, Teresa Millett, and some mining engineers in the Bonanza Hills. So that's all I have really. And let's see, I might have a few closing comments to make. I guess not really, but this was ground truthing you know, working, taking what elders shared with Jim Carey, and then having archaeologists, professional archaeologists and historians get out there. And we had people from Nundalton helping out on the excavation and running the boats. And so it was a real team effort, and all those agencies and the private sector. So it was a fun and rewarding process and project. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. That was terrific. And now I want to head over to our final presenter, Bob Kane. Bob came to Alaska in 1978 to work as a journalist at Dillingham's public radio station, KDLG. In his 17 years there, he took an interest in the over 100-year history of the Bristol Bay fishery. He later worked as an assistant for the Alaska governor, Tony Knowles, and then the US Senator, Mark Bagage. Bob has written several articles for Alaska history and other regional and fishery publications. His deep knowledge of Bristol Bay was critical for getting the Diamond NN Cannery listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This was the first cannery in Bristol Bay to receive such recognition. And it's been my honor to work very closely with Bob for the last 6 years on the NN Cannery History Project. Bob now lives in Juneau, where he is going to give his presentation from. So take it away, Bob.
Great. Thanks, Katie. You can hear me all and everything looks good?
Everything's good, Bob.
Great. Okay, before I begin, I want to give a shout out to Lewis McDonald and Donald Orth. Their references are among the first I turn to when I'm researching cannery history, but they don't get everything always right. McDonald gets Hallerville wrong, but the error comes from earlier Bureau of Fishery reports. Orth gets the coordinates right, but he doesn't know the story that followed, including the fact that Hallerville later moved and changed its name. First, some background. The Kvichak River extends 70 miles up from the mouth on Bristol Bay to Lake Iliamna. It has two villages, neither of which appear in these maps. Levelok's about 19 miles above the mouth, and Igiagig is where it enters the lake. Its extensive habitat makes the Kvichak arguably Bristol Bay's most productive salmon river. Arguable because harvests are combined with the adjacent Naknek River, also one of Bristol Bay's major salmon producers. But Kvichak runs have peaked at over 40 million sockeye in a single year. The Kvichak was and is a major producer in what is Alaska's strongest salmon fishery, with 6 major canneries. And there are a few minor canneries that I'm not going to get into today, but Hallerville was the furthest one upriver. The name Hallerville recognizes Joseph Peter Haller. He was manager of the Sacramento Canneries Association, who came up to Bristol Bay from Black Diamond, California, now known as Pittsburgh, hired to build the first salmon cannery in Bristol Bay at Canneries in the Nushagak at 1885. Actually, the cannery operated the previous year, but it needed more work. It needed to be improved. And it later joined the Alaska Packers Association, or the APA. In 1886, Haller built the Bristol Bay Cannery near what's now known as Kanakanak, part of Dillingham. He helped his son-in-law, Crespi Hale, who worked for Bristol Bay for the next 40 years. I wrote a paper on him, which should be still available on the AHS webpage. In 1900, Haller and Hale formed the North Alaska Salmon Company and built their first cannery 14 miles up the Kvichak River. This was Hallerville. You can see the name right up on top, and not Hallersville, by the way, as it appears on maps and elsewhere. The Federal Board of Geographic Names doesn't generally approve of the use of possessives. And it included, in fact, 2 canneries, 1,000 feet apart. This wasn't that uncommon, but it would lead for later great confusion. Here's some photos of the cannery taken in 1909. Here's a front view of the Hallerville cannery, a picture from the rear, as well as the Chinese bunkhouses. The superintendent's home called Hallerville. And here's Joseph Haller on his horse carriage. And that was taken in Hallerville. This is Joseph Roll, who operated a store in Hallerville, as well as other cannery communities. And thanks to John Branson for sharing these, including this is Roll's wife, Mary, and their 2 sons. The one to the left is Joseph Roll Jr., one of the few who claim to be born in Hallerville. And this is a later picture of Joseph Roll Jr. at the Pioneers Home in 2002. His wife, Anna, appears next to him. He met at a nearby Kogyang cannery, which we'll talk. And again, thanks to John Branson for sharing these. Haller's North Alaska built other canneries, including the Malchatna cannery in 1903. Now, this was 2 miles south of Hallerville on the Kvichak River, and the name appears to be a variant of the Alagnak River and will lead to some confusion. Federal reports indicate the Malchatna was often mistaken as one of the 2 Hallerville canneries. This came after 1905, when one of the 2 Hallerville canneries was closed, perhaps due to the new Malchatna production, or maybe shifts in the river's channel. Shipping channels prompted the Malchatna cannery in 1912 to build a 2,000-foot dock extension to the Alagnak River. It was so long, and you can see it stretching out and behind. They had to not only build a dock, but they built a railroad line to be able to move fish to the cannery and back. In 1913, though, continuing problems led Haller to move his namesake cannery 19 miles south out of the river and into Kvichak Bay near Peterson Point. He rebuilt the cannery but retained the name Hallerville. 2 years later, in 1915, Joseph P. Haller died. His North Alaska packers were bought the next year by Chicago meat packers Libby McNeil and Libby. The name Hallerville was initially retained. You can see early Libby ads wrongly called it Hallerville. But a few years later, in 1918, the name was changed to Libbyville. So Hallerville moved to become what became Libbyville, but we're still confused with Malchatna, which Libby also acquired. Adding to the confusion, one of the original Hallerville site was used by the Carlisle Packing Company, one of the first floating processors to work in Bristol Bay in 1922. It was bought out by the APA, though, a few years later and abandoned. Hallerville, Malchatna, and Libbyville weren't the only canneries on the Kvichak. In 1895, the APA built the first Kvichak cannery called Point Roberts, or Kogyang. It was located 5 miles downriver from the Alagnak. and better known in the APA's shorthand as the Diamond J. The APA built another Kvichak cannery in 1900, the Diamond X, also known as Bear Slough or Coffee Creek. Similar to Malchatna, they had to build an extended dock over 2,000 feet to reach the waterfront on Coffee Creek. In 1904, there was, again, another cannery, the Union Cannery, built near Levelock, but it only lasted three years and nothing remains other than the name of Union Creek across from the village. In 1910, a new cannery was built at the mouth of the Kvichak River called Graveyard Point, and it was later bought up by Libby as well as their third cannery. And the last cannery built on the river was the Nakian Company, operated by the New England Fish Company, and it was opposite from the Diamond X. They built that in 1925. Well, these Kvichak canneries didn't last very long. Even with its lengthy dock, Malchatna struggled with the Alagnak River and was closed in 1936. A fire mostly destroyed the facility 2 years later. The Diamond X, also troubled by its 2,000-foot dock, never reopened after 1941. The Graveyard Cannery at the mouth of the Kvichak River was also was reopened briefly, actually, in the late 40s, but it was soon shut down. And the Diamond J lasted longer than all of them. This was just after powerboats were introduced, and being that far upriver was just another fuel expense. Here's a picture of some Diamond J set netters in 1948. They're on the Kvichak. Nefco's Nakin cannery held on until 1966, when the last Kvichak River cannery was closed. These closures are not well documented, but I think there are several reasons why all this happened. First was the meandering river channels in the Kvichak that resulted in lengthy deck extensions needed to get raw product to the cannery and finished goods to the ships, even just getting up and down the river. One of the first Commerce Department inspections of the Kvichak cannery in 1903 left Naknek at 9 in the morning and ran aground an hour later, where it was stuck for almost 16 hours. Inspector Howard Cutchin described the river as obscure on account of extensive shoals and a tortuous channel. The vessel listed over in the mud and wasn't rightened until midnight. The crew and Cutchin spent the day at an angle that made occupancy of her very uncomfortable, and being without food and only tepid water, the occasion was not to be pleasantly remembered. Once righted, Cutchin transferred to another boat with great satisfaction, saying the chances were that the first captain, who couldn't keep the channel in the daylight, would make a bad job of following the course in the dark. Second were regulations, increasing regulations on the industry. When Hallerville and most of these other canneries were originally built, fishing was allowed anywhere in the river as long as it was 500 feet wide. The Union Cannery could fish right off its dock near Levelock, although it didn't prove to be a good idea for them. There was growing industry recognition that salmon for commercial use tastes better when caught in salt water rather than in the rivers. The sockeye don't feed when they return to spawn. They just burn their body fat and lose their flavor. In 1924, fishing regulations were revised. The Bureau of Fisheries moved the upper Kvichak limit to the Diamond J. Later, as runs showed problems, the line was moved down to Graveyard, near to where it is today. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and later Dutch Harbor, canneries were forced to consolidate their efforts to address needs for wartime personnel, as well as shipping needs, and also provide needed food for the Army from Bristol Bay salmon. So they combined canneries 2 for 1. The Diamond X was shuttered in preference of the Diamond J, and the Diamond X never reopened. The same happened to other canneries in Bristol Bay and elsewhere. But more importantly, in response to growing tensions that were leading up to World War II, the Army Corps Air Corps built the King Salmon Airport in 1941, in early 1941, before Pearl Harbor. They disguised their construction plans as the Consolidated Packing Company. During the war, the airport played a huge role to help get military aircraft out to the Aleutians, and after the war, the base turned over to the Air Force, played a major role in the Cold War. More importantly, though, to salmon canners, the King Salmon Airport allowed commercial air traffic into Bristol Bay. Fishermen and cannery workers could fly into the bay in a day rather than spend a week on a steamer. That gave a big advantage, by the way, to the Naknek canneries. With better transportation and improved canning technology, they could handle all of the salmon in the Naknek Kvichak district. The conclusion of the war also brought a surplus of Liberty ships and other cargo vessels that challenged the industry's structure. They forced the industry to shift from sailboats to power in 1951. Many of the new ships also converted to freezer ships, and which would later emerge as a product of its own. Other factors also played a role. The introduction of improved technology in the canning lines reduced the need for duplicate canneries, but also lack of management, weakened runs and harvests due to overfishing in the early century introduced a need for scientific management of the fisheries by the University of Washington's Fisheries Research Institute, which began in 1947. Let me conclude with just a few recent photos of these former ghost canneries along the Kvichak. Here is the site of Hallerville, taken in 1992. It's still visible today, but not much more overgrown, not so obvious. And looking at Google Maps, what appear to be tracks across the tundra seem to have linked Hallerville with Lochinok. Including most Lochinok structures were destroyed by fire in the 30s, but some scraps are still evident today. Including at the end of that 2,000-foot dock, you can see several towboats and tally scows rotting along the ways. The Diamond J was closed in the 1950s and was mostly destroyed by fire around 1980. The Diamond X was mostly scavenged for lumber. I'm told some local hunters still use some of the side buildings in the front here hunters use it for time to time for places to stay. A photo from a few years ago also shows much of the former cannery has since burned, and there's not much left anymore. Nakeen, the cannery, the last operating cannery on the Kvichak over 50 years ago, is falling apart. It was sold, by the way, as a hunting lodge, but the new owner was unaware of all the contamination that was left behind: bunker oil, coal, asbestos. If anybody wants this cannery today, you can get it probably for free, but you also have to inherit all the liabilities due to the hazardous contamination. Even local native groups have turned the free property down. The main cannery at buildings at Graveyard at the mouth of the river was mostly destroyed by fire many years ago, but the site is still used by setnetters. So some buildings are still used and remain in good shape. Even Libbyville, the relocated Hallerville on Kvichak Bay, is completely gone today. Although if you go on Google Maps, you can still see some pilings in the mud and the extent of erosion that's happened along the shoreline. The Kvichak canneries were replaced by canneries on the Naknek and floating processors. Several still operate, but even there, many of its historic canneries have been shut down and abandoned as floating processors replaced many of the historic canneries on the river as the industry changed from canned salmon to fresh frozen. I'd like to recognize the Haller family, specifically Thomas Edward Clark, for sharing their family photographs, a truly unique collection. Thanks also to Howard Cutchin, the Bureau of Fisheries Inspector at the turn of the 20th century, John Branson with the National Park Service at Lake Clark, the University of Washington Special Collections in Seattle, and the U.S. Air Force, Air Force Historical Research Agency in Maxwell, Alabama. That and the support of Katie Ringsmith, Tim Troll, Heidi Mathieson, and Russell Nelson. Many canneries, remain in Bristol Bay, and many canneries have been lost over the years, not just on the Kvichak, but elsewhere. And efforts are being made not to preserve these canneries, which would be far too expensive, but remember the stories of the people who fished for the salmon, the people who worked the canning lines, the people who supported the industry, and the role that these people played in Alaska history. Thank you.
All right, well, that was terrific, guys. So you guys have some questions coming in. So Tim, lots of good feedback here. One question is, was the garden fence built to prevent witch critters?
I don't know. All the people that would know that answer are dead now. I suspect it was not moose. I would guess probably, if anything, it would be loose dogs.
Yeah. Larice notes she lives in Bristol Bay, and she had heard that the folks out there were trying to organize the restoring of the cross.
Well, last time I was out there, earlier this year, I ran into Gusty Wall, who built the cross in the local N&N grocery store. And he said, unfortunately, it broke in an area where he didn't quite get enough fiberglassing and it rotted. Oh. And that's what caused it to fall. And looking at it, it would be pretty hard to resurrect that cross. They'd have to build another one.
Let's see. Carol asks, what are the buildings at the Nushagak site now? Camps, is the site still used? And what's going on there now?
It's just a summer fish camp for the most part, and many of the people who are there are not from the region. There are a few people locally who have a fish camp there, but many of them are from out of state. So they've established sort of I think it's mostly Seventh-day Adventist summer community there on Nushagak Point.
Where on the lower Nushagak are the buildings affected by extreme tides, tsunami, increased water levels over time? So perhaps an environmental change, warming question here?
Well, tsunamis aren't really an issue out there. It does flood. And in fact, the Russians reported that there was a major flood there, I think not long after they built the fort, and had to move it back and up. And so there's always been some questions exactly where the fort was. So yes, flooding can be a problem. And that's why you do see the building sort of on the tierces in the background. But as you saw in the one photograph taken by C.W. Ray, it's also, like Bob mentioned on the Kvichak, I think probably Nushagak began to fail primarily because the river changed course And now it's just a lot of mud out in front of it, and makes it very difficult.
Another building question for you, Tim. Penelope asks about with the famous Swaits photo of the sick little boy. She asks, were you able to determine if it was which building it was, or was it the old store, the Mittendorf building or the old store?
Well, if you saw in the latter photographs, there was a third building that was put in next to probably not, yeah, it's pretty easy to identify. And by the way, as a result of that hands project, we did find out who the shaman was, and we found out who the little boy was. And he wasn't sick. He was actually the son of the shaman.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, I'm going to, John, why did the Dena'ina village names end? Perhaps Petroff's map ended there. Are there subsequent villages named? Origins? What is the origins of Lunchbox is the question.
Lunchbox was the name that the guide in the area had put to that area where they used to hunt. And so that's how we adopted the local usage of the guide, their terminology, because we didn't know, we couldn't establish a known Dena'ina name. And the Lunchbox is 400 or 500 yards away from the actual Dena'ina village.
Gotcha. Okay.
Had it been at one of the rivers where the confluence where we had an established name, Dena'ina name, of course we would have used that, but we found 16 different villages, and we only had 5 names for them.
Gotcha. So here's a question for Bob. Who worked in all of those canneries? You referenced a Chinese barrack. How many local Alaska Natives worked there? And did the owners bring in a lot from the lower 48?
The answer to that last question, of course, is yes. There was a number of non-resident, but canners, but primarily the Chinese, Mexicans, Filipinos, later Japanese. Yes, natives were encouraged actually to work in the canneries, and did so often before the season and then after the season, because they wanted to get the fishing in. But the strongest, highest use actually was also followed, native use rather, was after the war itself, when there was an incredible demand, unionization efforts among the natives and the others. But that's a story unto itself, and for some other future conference.
Tim, has the current U.S.-Russian standoff impacted your ability to work with your comrades these days? Is he free to travel in Alaska?
Well, I haven't heard from Comrade Malakov in a long time. I did actually give a shortened version of this presentation to a conference that they were holding over in Branson just a couple of weeks ago, but I couldn't do it by Zoom because of I wasn't going to wait up that late to sit in on it. So I did send them a presentation, which I assume they used. So I haven't heard from Comrade Malakov in a while as to whether, you never know, he could pop up any day. But I think it's been more COVID in terms of going back and forth. And he hasn't told me that he's been restricted from traveling here. And he's been going other places now anyway.
So, Tim, another question here. Were there, in the historic period, were there any sort of links between the Russian forts on the Nushagak as well as the Kenai Peninsula?
Well, they share the same name, but probably different Alexanders. Certainly Fort Alexander on the Nushagak was after Baranov, who basically chartered the last excursion in 1818. As far as I know, I don't know. It's not something I've investigated. I think during that Russian era, they were mostly supplied out of Kodiak, and that was the means of transport across Shelikof Strait into Bristol Bay.
John, I have a question for you from Megan. Why did the people leave or abandon the villages in Malchatna?
They left for a number of reasons, but one would have been that the commercial fishery on the Nushagak River reduced the salmon escapement up into the Malchatna, and the priest at Nushagak, who had visited them at the Dinina villages on the Malchatna, he recommended they leave there. And at the same time that was happening, the prospectors, American prospectors, were coming in, and they brought in things like the flu and TB. And so people started to die, both by starvation and from epidemic diseases. So that was the main reason. And another reason would have been around, well, I was going to say it was the establishment of a trading post, but the trading post was already there at Iliamna, and they also would trade at Nushagak. So it was more commercial salmon development, which corking off the river, reducing escapement and epidemic diseases, and the recommendation of the priest to leave that area.
Okay. Megan also has a question for Tim. Was there any backlash from the Alaska Natives or others to erect, in the erection of the memorial to a white dude at Nushagak?
Well, none that I'm aware of. I mean, we did it, the community of Dillingham was quite involved, and we certainly had a big reception for Malakoff and his team when they came there. And the Russian Orthodox Church, we involved them from the very beginning. And the little plaque that we put on there not only commemorated Kolmakov, but also commemorated his companions and the Alaska Native people that really sort of established that whole area as a central point for trading in the region. And then we also threw in John W. Clark, because he was sort of the one there during the American period. So not that I'm aware of, and if somebody was really angry, it wouldn't take much but a chainsaw to take that thing down.
So Bob, I have a question for you. Would you comment about technology, international capital flow into the fishing industry relative to international resource demand and technology? Now we seem to also acknowledge the effects of natural forces in altering the environment of the Canneries. So that's a dissertation right there, Bob. So
it is, you know, and I thought my presentation would be limited to 1966 at the latest. But, you know, you're right. Technology over the years has, in the salmon business, has slowly improved. There were lots of issues that they had to address. And a lot of it changed quite recently when they put in fresh frozen, brought in fresh frozen technology for a changing market. That started to change in the 1980s, but has really taken off now, and that's you know, shut down some of the former canneries just by itself. International capital flow, lots of Japanese investments and others certainly have come in. They helped actually bring some of their technology in, but it remains very controversial among fishermen and fishing communities. And a lot of fishermen are watching the environmental issues very, very closely today, looking at ups and downs in the salmon runs, knowing how they're affected by water temperatures and the like. Bristol Bay is locked out. I mean, we've had the past 5 years have been produced harvests of 40 million or maybe more years. It's been incredibly strong. But if you look up at the Yukon Kuskokwim, the fish runs are down. Chignik has been closed for several years. There are lots of issues. I don't think everybody. I don't think anybody knows, all the answers here. But I would certainly say that climate issues and environmental issues are being taken very, very seriously by the industry.
Great. Well, we have time for a few more questions. John, you have a question from Larice. I was wondering, were the Petroff's 1884 Malchatna villages map, was it published? Did he publish a map?
Yes, he did. It was part of the book that is called The Report of the Population, Industries, and Resources of Alaska. And it was published part of the 10th census, and it was published in 1884. That's where the map is. And that book, it should be in most libraries in Alaska. And it was one of the first books that gave a general history and ethnography of the geology and, general information about Alaska, the configuration of the mountain ranges and everything. So yeah, it's part of that. It had a lot of flaws in it, no doubt, but it was the first. And Petroff is an interesting character himself, a great writer, and he had a checkered career, however.
Actually, John, Sue has a question for you as well. Family names that you mentioned in your talk are names that are known today in the area. Did those families originate in the Malchatna villages and spread out, or were they widespread historically in the region and also in the Malchatna villages? Del Kitty and Zach are two of the names that she mentioned.
Yeah, well, with our research, we found the oldest site we have is about 1500. It's thought that the Dinahina moved into the area of southwestern Alaska, Lake Clark, the eastern end of Iliamna, the Malchatna, Talakwana, Stony River, about 1,200 years ago or so. Maybe they were there earlier. Maybe that's their homeland up around the Stony River area, and they spread southwesterly and into Cook Inlet, and it's thought 1,200 years ago. So, I mean, I don't think they necessarily just sprung up, but they moved into the Malchatna, over time as the resources became available there. So there was I couldn't say where one particular family, but the Russian Orthodox records I've looked at and Matt O'Leary worked on to get a genealogy of the Malchatna the best he could. The first person that's in the genealogy from the Malchatna was born around 1799. And that's when the Russians gave them names. And so, like Trifon, that is, I believe the origin would be Trefim, like a Russian name. And I don't know about Noodleash, and Zakar obviously is a Russian origin name. So, I mean, where the names come from, other than that, I couldn't say. I have to ask a linguist.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. And if you have any other questions, folks, just go ahead and type it in the chat. We'll record it, pass those on. But Bob, canneries were primarily company towns with limited cash and use of script. So how are locals paid? What is the question?
That's a good question, and I don't have a real firm answer. I know there are several reports that are in there that they were offered cash, but in the early days, back in the days of Hallerville, they couldn't pay a lot of the native population much because they didn't have any place to spend it. They didn't have any. They didn't need it for their food. They, in fact, there are lots of stories in some of the early reports that the native population would work at the canneries before the season began, but as soon as the fish started running, they bailed out. And to a certain extent, that still happens today, doesn't it, Katie? That they have the spring and fall season, but the fishermen want to, the cannery, a lot of the resident cannery workers want to go fishing, either commercially or beforehand subsistence, where they really depended on it. I don't know whether they used script back in the early days, and that's a good question to ask and try to find out. But I'll look for that, Ron.
All right, guys, we are out of time. This was a great session. Before you take off, I do want to just plug the upcoming session starting at 3:30, Food and Drink in Alaska, which is just in time for Friday night festivities. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. I wish I could see you, but let's hope for better days next year. Bye guys, it was great to see you guys.
Well, and
take care.
This is Karen hosting that. Since we don't, it's a short time to the next session, I can just leave this on if people just want to stay logged in, and I'll take these guys off the panel and put the other people in, so you don't have to look at everybody, but you can log out and log back in, or you can just stay on and hang out and wait, or go do something else. But figured I might as well just do that. Oh, and I should stop the recording. Okay.